Welcome to In the Word, a study of the International Bible School lesson. Join us as we learn from area professors and teachers as they bring you their thoughts and knowledge of the study of the Sunday School lesson for today. Now, here is today's program.
Welcome, friends. Thanks so much for joining us as we continue our study in the Word, our series of International Sunday School lessons. We're exploring the Gospel of Matthew for a few weeks here, and we're in our second of 5 lessons from Matthew. Dr. Roberts, we like Matthew just about as much as Luke, right? You can't lose here in these Gospels.
No.
And Matthew is so fascinating. You mentioned last week that it's the most Jewish of our Gospels, of our 4 Gospels, and yet it emphasizes in some fascinating ways Jesus' love and outreach to Gentiles.
It's inclusive.
As well.
Right.
Yeah. So that's kind of a paradox there, that the very most Jewish also highlights the Gentile mission. Jesus is called the son of Abraham, and Abraham was the one through whom God planned to bless all the families of the earth. And we see that coming to fulfillment in the ministry of Jesus. Our overarching theme is still about discipleship and mission, and we definitely see those themes in today's lesson, don't we?
In today's.
We have a lesson about disciples whom Jesus had already called to follow him, being sent out on mission,
and sent forth
on their own.
Yes.
So we get to see both discipleship and mission in action, and that's our overarching theme. Now, last week the emphasis was on discipleship, where we were studying the passage about the calling of the 4 fishermen,
to
right?
follow Jesus.
Yeah, so that's the definition of discipleship, to get in line behind Jesus. And this week we're going to multiply it from 4 to 12 and get the mission of the 12.
We'll get some more of the 12 listed here, and sometimes we won't hear from some of them again.
Yeah.
But they're all important.
The only time we ever see most of the 12 are in lists of the 12. We don't really know much about we don't know anything about their ministries.
Yeah.
But then we know quite a lot about a few of them. The church over the centuries has filled in the gaps with some legends about their ministries.
Their stories.
Yeah, and those legends may be based in kernels of fact. We don't know. There is a very strong tradition that Thomas, for instance, went to India. And the Christians of India to this day,
they're strongly
are the Mar Thoma Christians. They trace their faith directly to Thomas and have no doubt that he was there ministering. So could well be. But we're going to meet all 12 today, and then learn about what Jesus had in mind for them. They've been following Jesus for some time. We're jumping from chapter 4 to chapter 10. In chapter 4, we read about the call that Jesus started calling disciples. In chapter 9, we meet a 5th, Matthew. But now, in chapter 10, they've been following him long enough that he's ready to send them forth on their own mission.
And they've heard some great teaching. Matthew 5, 6, 7, the Sermon on the Mount, and several parables in the chapters that follow. They're significant teachings of Jesus. So they had been around. As disciples, they were learning of Jesus.
Right.
But now there comes a point when the learning is such that now you've got to share it.
Yeah. And they've not only been listening to Jesus teach so that they're ready to share some of his teachings, they've been watching him minister to the needs of people in Capernaum and in the villages around Galilee.
And we'll see that in his commissioning of them as they go forth, that it's both teaching and doing.
Yeah. And he has modeled that for them, and now he wants them to replicate that in their lives and in their ministries. Our text starts in chapter 10, verse 1, but the very last little paragraph of chapter 9 provides the context for this and makes the point that you and I are discussing right now, and that is what Jesus has been doing over these last. So we have a little summary here. Jesus has been going around all the cities and villages of Galilee, teaching in their synagogues, proclaiming good news of the kingdom. We learned last week that his message was
Kingdom of heaven.
The kingdom of heaven is near, and curing every disease and sickness. So that's a beautiful summary of what Jesus' ministry has been like during these last chapters that we've skipped over here. This introductory passage goes on to say that Jesus' ministry was motivated by his compassion. And although that concept doesn't come out in our text today, I think it does underlie it, that Jesus expects them to carry compassion for those to whom they minister.
He saw the people as sheep without a shepherd.
Yeah.
And they were in need.
Right. And then the last thing in this introductory paragraph at the end of chapter 9 is Jesus' statement that the harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. And it seems to be that sentiment that motivates Jesus to send out his disciples as missionaries, apostles. Yeah. So that's the very last little paragraph of chapter 9 that kind of sets us up for what we have here. Yeah. Okay, well, let me read our passage, which is the first 15 verses of Matthew chapter 10. Jesus called his 12 disciples to him and gave them authority to drive out impure spirits and to heal every disease and sickness. These are the names of the 12 apostles. First, Simon, who is called Peter, and his brother Andrew, James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John, Philip and Bartholomew, Thomas and Matthew the tax collector, James, son of Alphaeus and Thaddeus, Simon the Zealot, and Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him. These 12 Jesus sent out with the following instructions. Don't go among the Gentiles or enter any town of the Samaritans. Go rather to the lost sheep of Israel. As you go, proclaim this message. The kingdom of heaven has come near. Heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse those who have leprosy, drive out demons. Freely you have received, freely give. Don't get any gold or silver or copper to take with you in your belts. No bag for the journey or extra tunic or sandals or a staff, for the worker is worth his keep. Whatever town or village you enter, search there for some worthy person and stay at their house until you leave. As you enter the home, give it your greeting. If the home is deserving, let your peace rest on it. If it's not, let your peace return to you. If anyone will not welcome you or listen to your words, leave that home or town and shake the dust off your feet. Truly, I tell you, it will be more bearable for Sodom and Gomorrah on the day of judgment than for that town. All right, this is the calling of the 12 and the naming of the 12 apostles.
Right.
Those are that's a new number and a new name.
And this is the only time that Matthew uses the word apostle to refer to them. Otherwise, he calls them disciples or the 12. But here he's specifically calling them apostles.
Okay. So in verse 1, we get the first reference to the 12, which you say is a common phrase for term for Matthew.
And 12 is an important number.
Yeah, we better talk about 12 and why he calls it. He certainly has way more than 12 disciples.
A lot of followers.
Yeah. He calls 12 of the disciples and sends them out as apostles, that is, missionaries. Okay, well, let's catch up on this number 12 a little bit.
Of course, you've got 12 tribes, the 12 sons of Jacob, and 12 tribes.
Which kind of becomes the identity of Israel, doesn't it? The 12 tribes, the sons of Jacob. And would you say that probably supplies the main motive for choosing 12 apostles?
Seems to be a very conscious connection.
Yeah.
To the Old Testament and the Hebrew background.
Especially since as he says, he's first sending them out to the lost sheep of Israel.
Right.
So Jews thought of the 12 tribes as Israel. That's probably the main connection. But the number 12 is all over the Old Testament.
Yes.
It's not just the 12 sons of Jacob. In fact, Isaac's half-brother Ishmael had 12 sons as well,
right.
and 12 tribes came from those 12 sons. Well, what are some other 12s that
when they crossed the Jordan, they had 12 stones set up to commemorate
to make the memorial
right.
for the crossing of the river. There's a reference, lots of references to 12s in the temple and in the tabernacle before the temple. 12 utensils and 12 sacrifices and 12 loaves of unleavened bread and
the multiples of 12. You
like
have 24 and 12 sometimes.
Right.
But 12 is a key number frequently. And apparently it's the 3 and the 4 emphasis, as when you get 7, but you also get the multiple 12.
Yeah, the two most important symbolic numbers in the minds of ancient people were 7 and 12. And you're right, both of them rely on 3 and 4. 7 is the sum, and 12 is the product of 3 and 4. And best we can figure, ancient people had identified the number, and not just Jews, but ancient people in general had identified the number 3 with deity, that is divinity, with the gods or God, long before Christians ever thought of the notion of Trinity.
Right.
3 had been connected with deity. And then 4 is a number they connected with the natural world or creation. So we have the 4 corners of the earth, the 4 winds. They believed that the earth was held up on 4 pillars or turtles, as in one legend. So you've got 3 and 4, and so the combination of 3 and 4, as you say, suggests wholeness or everything.
Completeness.
Completeness. Oh, but just another one popped into my mind. When they neared the border of Canaan, Moses sent 12 spies. We remember Joshua and Caleb, but there were actually 12 of them who went to check out the land. So, 12 has real important resonance with the Old Testament.
And we'll find out in the book of Revelation the connection of the apostles and the Old Testament. You get 24 elders.
That's right. That's right. And then 12 turns up in the final vision a couple places as well. Okay, well, we've been exploring the number 12 and why it was symbolically important. What about this word apostles, which appears first and only in Matthew in verse 2?
Yeah, it's the Greek word apostello, apostle, to send forth. Someone who's commissioned, given authority, and sent with a purpose.
Okay. So it's very similar to our word missionary, which also means someone sent forth. So we could think of that. In ancient times, the apostolos functioned somewhat like we think of an ambassador or an envoy or a representative of a king or something like that. And I think that's a helpful way to think, because an ambassador goes from a monarch, a ruler, to another country to convey some message from the monarch.
Right.
And they go under the authority of the monarch with the words of the monarch to accomplish the purpose of the monarch. And they're not acting on their own. They carry a message, and then they carry that back to the monarch. And that's a good way, I think, to think about it.
And the early church recognized that the apostles, those who'd been commissioned by Jesus, had more information and more authority. And so the apostolic testimony, the apostles' doctrine, became normative for the church.
Right.
And there became other teachings that arose at times but you could compare it with what did the apostles teach? What had Jesus told them?
Exactly.
And that becomes the substance of faith still.
And that's so important. Even there in the early church, where the apostles' teaching is so central, their authority was always tied back to their interaction and experience of Jesus.
Right.
So when they choose the 12th apostle to replace Judas, they're looking for somebody who was with him during his 3 years of ministry and witnessed the risen Lord.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the authority of Matthias didn't come from his own wisdom or spiritual strength or any of that. It came from his encounter with Jesus. So that's very important.
Yeah.
Thanks for bringing that up. So that's what an apostle is. Now, what about this list here in verses 2 and through 4?
It's interesting that they're given to us in pairs.
Yeah.
Twos by, two and twos.
And they're linked by the word "and."
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. What about what do we learn from that?
Well, the other Gospels and later we'll see Jesus sending out followers 2 by 2 specifically, and it's not mentioned that way here, and yet they're listed 2 by 2.
Right. So we can assume that they were. Now, what's significant about that, do you think?
Well, partly that it's a team concept. And we don't go as lone eagles or lone rangers. We go together, and the mutuality, the sharing in the relationship is part of the testimony, part of the witness.
Yeah. My wife is on a mission board, and they were interviewing, this is decades ago now, interviewing a person who was well trained in the mission, and she was ready to go to the field, and they had a village for her to go to, and she said, "I'm ready to go." And they said, "Well, you really need a partner." And she said, "Well, there is nobody ready to go, and I'm ready." And so they kind of stepped back from their own resolve that you'd never go alone to the mission field, and said, "Okay, well, you are ready. You're so prepared. Go ahead and go." So she came home for her first furlough and met with the board, and they said, "Well, how's it going?" She said, "Oh, great. I'm making wonderful progress." And they said, "Do you have any suggestions or, any feedback from you?" And she said, "Yes. You know how you sent me out there alone for the last 3.5 years? Don't you ever dare do that to anybody else again." And they said, "Hey, wait a minute. You're the one who talked us into it." And she said, "I know, but now I've learned the wisdom. You don't go as a solo missionary."
Yeah.
And so that had quite an impact on my wife and on the rest of them. So yeah, well put. Ministry is not a Lone Ranger sport, is it? Yeah. Well, so thanks for pointing out the pairs that we have here. Simon, as usual, is mentioned first. He seems to have had a real gift for leadership.
Yeah.
And we get his nickname Peter. And we've met his fisherman brother Andrew, who seems to be his teammate. We've already met James and John.
Sons of Zebedee.
By the way, James is the name Jacob. We've anglicized it, but it's the very common Old Testament name Jacob. So we've met them. Now Philip and Bartholomew.
Philip comes up in John's Gospel. Bartholomew, we don't see that name elsewhere. Some think that Nathaniel, who's mentioned in John's Gospel, is Bartholomew by another name.
If so, he had two really mouthfuls of names.
Right.
Nathaniel Bartholomew, if he's the same person.
Yeah.
Thomas and Matthew are often linked.
And of course, Matthew is named Levi elsewhere, the tax collector.
And here he's referred to as the tax collector. This is the only list of apostles where Matthew is identified as the tax collector. And some people have used that as evidence that Matthew indeed wrote this gospel, and that's why he added that in. And maybe not, we don't know. Yeah. And his calling to be a disciple is narrated in Matthew chapter 9, just previous to this. So we only have the calling stories of 5 of the 12. The 4 fishermen and Matthew. Yeah. Okay, who's next? James, another Jacob, son of Alphaeus.
James the Less, he's often called.
Yeah, although that's not really very nice, is it? No, James the Less.
The other James gets more prominence.
He is more prominent. And Thaddeus, we know nothing about.
Right.
Thaddeus.
Never
He's
see the name.
never mentioned again. Now, this last pair is fascinating. Obviously, Judas Iscariot is of interest to us because he becomes the betrayer, as it mentions right here. But Simon the Zealot, remind us what a zealot is.
Well, zealots at the time were a rabid anti-government group who, some of them were Sicaria, the dagger people. They were ready to play the role of assassins, terrorists.
Yeah, this is against Rome.
Against Rome.
Yeah.
But the zealots were super anti-Rome.
Yeah.
And then you've got a tax collector who works with Rome.
Which is a fascinating reminder of the diversity of the group that Jesus has assembled here, and what we call the 12 or the 12 apostles. And of course, we don't know much about these other people. We just have little glimpses. We know that James and John are hotheads and are kind of always looking for some advantage to get ahead because Jesus nicknames them sons of thunder, and they want to have the primary seats.
And they're ready to
with the Lord
rain down fire on a village and won't accept them.
So they're sons of thunder. And we can imagine that others of these people are kind of mild-mannered, laid-back people, like Andrew probably was.
Yeah.
So it's a mix of personalities.
Many are from Galilee, we're pretty sure of that. Judas is questioned because the name Iscariot, or the title Iscariot, may refer to a little town in the south, which would be the only one from the area of Judea.
So far as we know,
But it may not mean that, and may mean something else.
Yeah.
So
there may be some geographical diversity. There's probably diversity of character traits and personality. There's definitely differences of political with the zealot and the tax collector. And Judas Iscariot may also have been a zealot. So they would have been naturally paired. That's possible. So it's a fascinating group, and it does show that that anyone can be called to ministry if they have devotion to the
And even though we don't hear a lot about some of these people, they were apparently important in the ministry of Jesus and played a role that maybe we don't know about, but God does.
Because the early church never forgot their names.
Yeah.
And this is one of several lists, not only in the Gospels, but in the book of Acts as well. Well, that's who they are. Now let's get on to the instructions here, because we learn who they should minister among, how they should minister, and what they should take with them and expect when they arrive in those places. So we get some really interesting information here. The first thing Jesus tells them is here in verse 5 about who he wants them to minister among at first, where he wants them to start. And by the way, notice here in verse 5, this verb sent out, that's the verb form of the noun apostle.
Apostolo.
Okay, so what about this command not to go among Gentiles or Samaritans, only to Jews?
That appears to be a priority of time, not of importance. But their first mission is to reach the people of Israel. And so it's a matter of timing. We'll find in John's gospel especially a lot of references to the timing of Jesus' ministry. And here you get the impression that this is our first priority, to reach the lost of Israel.
And I think to explain that, we could point out two things. One, those are the people that the apostles were most prepared to communicate with, because they are Jews.
They're from there,
And the Jews of Jesus' day were the people most prepared to hear the good news of the kingdom. So it's a matter of priority, not that they're worth more or they're more deserving, but that's the place to start. Jesus is already ministering to Gentiles and to Samaritans. So it's not that he doesn't want them to hear the good news of the kingdom. It's just that the apostles maybe aren't quite ready to minister in those fields.
And we find when he was on a retreat at one point, a woman from Syrophoenicia came and asked for help for her daughter. And at first, that's not what I'm here for.
Yeah.
But then, because of her persistence, he helped her. But again, it's a point that we've got to do what we've got to do first, and then we'll do the other.
So it's more a matter of strategic importance,
Right.
Rather than they're inherently more important. Okay, so that's who they minister among. The second thing he mentions is what their ministry should entail, and we see that in verses 7 and 8, and it involves proclamation, teaching about the kingdom, and healing and meeting physical needs.
And it's important to notice that Jesus' ministry and what he sent them to do was both the teaching, the message, but also the service,
Okay.
the rendering of benefit to people.
So the church today doesn't have to flip a coin and decide either or.
Right.
Do we evangelize or do we work for social justice?
Right.
We don't have to make that up. Both things were central to Jesus' ministry, and Jesus says both things need to be central to your ministry. Yeah, good point. Then he gives them instructions about what to take with them, and his point is mainly to limit the amount of stuff and money and tools and resources, the baggage that they take with them. What do you think his main goal is there?
Again, it's apparently time is short. You've got to get out there and do this now, and don't worry about packing all those things. And when you go, stay with the people where you are. Don't shop for a better accommodation or better food or whatever. Take what they serve you and stay there.
I think trust is also a feature here. You don't have to rely on your ability to pack well.
Right.
So you take everything with you that you're going to need on this trip. Trust God and trust the people of God that you are ministering among to care for you as you share with them.
And you're not going to feather your own nest. You don't go to receive. Freely received, freely give. Yeah. It's not a matter of looking to what you can get out of it.
Right, or to seek greater advantage by moving up to a better home or get better food. The last thing that's talked about in this passage is also important, and that is what happens when you're not well received. Yeah. What happens when you're rejected.
It's a fascinating thing. When you enter a home, give it your greeting. If the home is deserving, let your peace rest there. If it isn't, take your peace back. And the Hebrew concept was that when you say the shalom, the peace, it's like a physical object. If it isn't received, you take that back.
So we have the possibility of rejection that Jesus warns them about right at the start and says, look, if this happens, don't stay there and beat your head against a slammed door. Let it go.
Shake the dust off.
Yes, just don't even take the dust with you, and don't worry, just move on and hope for a better reception in the next place. The way Jesus did when he came to that Samaritan village and they wouldn't be hospitable, and Jesus, they want to call down the vengeance of God on them, and Jesus said, no, let's just go to the next village. Maybe they'll be better. Well, thank you for joining us for this conversation. What we've seen is that when we are sent by God, we are sent not with our own authority, but the authority of Jesus. And not with our own ministry agenda, but with his ministry agenda and for his own purposes. I hope you'll join us this week trying to live out the mission of Jesus in our lives. See you next week.
This has been In the Word, a study of the International Bible School lesson brought to you as a ministry of First Christian Church in Johnson City, Tennessee. Our thanks to our teachers that led us for this week's lesson. Join us again next week for another lesson from the International Bible School lesson text. This has been a production of First Christian Church.